studying a topic that is sensitive and has caused a great deal of pain for a great number of people in our community. So we pray that through the process of this course, you will help us to become more compassionate in our dealings with chemically dependent persons. We ask your blessing upon each person here in the class. Educate us, help us to better understand an issue that's so important in our community. For we ask these things in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, and the good physician. Amen.
Amen.
Rich, I need.
I want to start by just kind of reintroducing myself and telling you a little bit about how I came to be interested in the whole topic of chemical dependency, and especially in the recovery process. I call this course Understanding Addiction, the Spirituality of Recovery. So the real goal of the class is to gain some understanding of the spiritual aspects of recovery from this disease. But it might help just if I give you a little background. When I went to Dubuque Seminary back in the day. I started in '76, so that takes me back a few years. We had a professor, Dr. Howard Wallace. He was professor of Old Testament and he taught Hebrew. And just a great person, a wonderful teacher, and he was a recovering alcoholic. And he was quite open about that. And I think his goal in being open, or one of his goals, was to help us seminarians at least get familiar with the fact that this was an issue we were going to face.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, there's no chance that we wouldn't. We would definitely face this issue. And so by being upfront about his recovery, it gave us hope, because we could see someone who was intelligent and bright and effective and capable and fully into recovery. So there was always hope for people who suffer from this disease. So that sort of opened the door to me for as far as an interest in that kind of recovery. When I was a pastor in Marion, Indiana, I was approached by the owner of a local treatment center for alcoholics and addicts. And that was back in the day when you had almost always inpatient treatment. This treatment center was offering, 6 to 7 to 8 weeks of inpatient care for alcoholics and addicts, which is unheard of today because of insurance. You just can't do it anymore. But he called one day and said, would you be interested in doing some training, taking some training, and volunteering as a chaplain in our treatment center? And I said, yes, I would, because I was thinking of Dr. Wallace, and I had that openness to it. So they put a group of us through a couple of weeks of training, and our goal was to work with recovering folks, and this was a 12-step based program. So when those folks got to their 4th step, which is a searching and fearless moral inventory, they would have clergy review the results of that inventory. Because the 5th step says, confess, something to the effect that confess the exact nature of our wrongs to God and at least one other human being. And so this treatment center wanted clergy to be the ones who sat down with recovering folks and heard them talk about their 4th step. And then our role was to express the gospel, the graciousness of God, the fact that there was hope and forgiveness, and kind of turn them loose to have a new life in recovery and to overcome the low self-esteem and the shame and the guilt that they felt as a result of their addiction. And I just fell in love with the work. And I don't know if I should say this in a church or not, but I used to say I would see more change in those folks, at least the ones who wanted to get well, the ones who were working a program. I would see more change in those folks and growth in 5 or 6 weeks than I might see in some of my congregation members in 5 or 6 years. So I just fell in love with the work. And I eventually wound up becoming a paid chaplain, and then over the course of the next 17 years, worked in a number of hospital-based treatment programs. They were all AA-based or 12-step based. So they welcomed the clergy, into their staff. The funding ran out, primarily because insurance really cracked down on chemical dependency treatment, and not without reason. I used to work for the care unit in Cincinnati. That was a national chain of addictions treatment hospitals. And we were expected to admit everybody who walked in the door. I mean, they really abused. It was a for-profit company. And so there's reasons why insurance companies had to crack down. But I wound up working for a number of some very good treatment centers, and just enjoyed the work. I found it just very meaningful, challenging but meaningful work. I got to work with recovering people not only as a chaplain but as a case manager. So when the funding ran out for chaplaincy, I just took the training and got a credential and became an alcohol and drug counselor. I did that half-time for about 17 years. And until the work just wore me out. Toward the end, I have to admit, I wanted sometimes to get up, crawl over the top of my desk and choke like a lion. And that was just because of the denial. You know, all those years of dealing with denial and hearing it over and over again, and I kind of burned out. So I went back into ministry full time, and so I have a couple of disclosures to make, or disclaimers. The first is I've not practiced this form of therapy for 19 years. So it's possible that some of this material is outdated that I'm going to be presenting. Although I don't think so, because I've got a good friend I met in one of those hospitals. We used to go camping together a couple times a year. And he says really not much has changed. So I think most of what I'm going to present is going to be up to date or close to it. But I thought I should make that disclaimer. I've not practiced for 19 years. And the other disclaimer is I'm not here to spoil your drinking. If you're a social drinker, one of the things I like about Lawrence is there's lots of good small breweries and great beer. And if you can enjoy that without problems, more power to you. I'm not here to spoil your drinking. I'm not a recovering person myself. I do like a beer or a glass of wine with a meal. So. Patients used to give me a hard time about that. They say, well, what do you know about recovery if you're not addicted? And I'd say, well, you don't have to have cancer in order to be able to treat it. So that usually settled them down. Anyway, that just kind of some background so that you know where I'm coming from. The goals for this class. I want to increase your understanding of addiction as a disease. I want to, the main point, and this we'll get to this next week, I want to explore the spiritual dimension of recovery. The whole 12 steps and how we did treatment, why we did it in groups and all of that. I want you to learn how addiction affects families, which would be the third class, and provide support for anyone that's coping with addiction. So, and I'm sure that we've got some experiences in this group, neighbors, family members, co-workers. You know, we used to say that the typical alcoholic has a dramatic effect or a significant effect on the lives of 6 to 7 people. So when you work in churches, that's primarily what you're going to find, is that you're going to find family members who are addicted and all of the trauma that goes with that. So in the third session, we'll have a chance to talk about that, share some things, and hopefully provide some support. Any questions so far? Is that making sense? Okay. Well, if we're going to understand addiction as a disease, we should probably begin with mind-altering or mood-altering chemicals. We're going to go to the study sheet now. Now, I'm not a pharmacologist, and I never was very knowledgeable about street drugs and all of the varieties of things that people use. But here's some of the basics. I just grouped them into broad categories. The first one being depressants. And we start with alcohol, which is actually the legal drug in our culture. It surprises people sometimes that alcohol is a drug, but it is a mind-altering drug. So we're talking beer, wine, spirits. Sometimes people think alcohol is a stimulant, but that's because it reduces inhibition. So when people drink, they get loud, and they talk more, and they do things they probably wouldn't do if they were sober. So it looks like a stimulant, but that's actually because the drug is depressing the central nervous system. Barbiturates, they don't really prescribe those much anymore. Used to be used as sleep aids. They used to prescribe them for me for migraine, but they don't do that anymore. They found that that's a highly addictive drug, so they just don't use them much. Tranquilizers are also depressants. So the main class of those these days is benzodiazepines, and you're talking about things like Xanax, Ativan, Klonopin, Those are some of the three big brand names. They're used to treat anxiety, so they're used to treat anxiety disorders. So those are depressants. There's another class of depressants called narcotics. And OxyContin, codeine, Vicodin, morphine, methadone, heroin, fentanyl. Those are some of the, there are others. There are legal ones that are by prescription only. They're controlled substances because they're narcotics, so they're highly addictive. Perfectly legitimate to use in pain management, especially short term. If you had surgery, if you had a broken bone, they provide a great deal of relief. Heroin is not a legal drug and has no medical use whatsoever. And fentanyl is a designer drug. It's an artificial narcotic. That's one of the most dangerous because drug dealers mix that into other things, and because there's no quality control, and because narcotics on the street are always cut with something to spread the profit margin, make more money. You never know what you're getting when you buy that stuff off the street. And very dangerous. Accidental overdoses are not uncommon. People who are used to buying from a certain source, they get used to a certain level of the active ingredient, and then all of a sudden they buy some pills that are, because of the lack of quality control, are much higher in potency, and they wind up in a hospital or even dead. So that's just dangerous stuff. Then you get into sedative hypnotics. These are sleep aids primarily. Ambien and Lunesta are a couple of the brands that are sold legally by prescription. Sleep aids, they can be safely used, but they can also be abused. So that takes us through depressants. Stimulants, now they work in the opposite way. Rather than suppressing the central nervous system, they elevate it, they stimulate it. So you've got, here you're going to run into drugs like cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine, nicotine, and something I've never heard called bath salts.
Yeah.
I don't know much about that.
It has nothing to do with baths.
No, it's not. I don't know why they call it that, but it is some sort of a stimulant. You probably have to Google that to find out what exactly.
They sell them as bath salts in stores.
Okay.
If the people are buying them,
Yeah. Misusing them or abusing them. Stimulants, what else would we say there?
I see you don't have caffeine down
No, caffeine would fit, but that's such a mildly addictive. It has a very mild mood altering effect. You feel a little better if you have a cup of coffee. I do in the morning, but it doesn't lead to the loss of control and the behavior changes. The worst thing is it might make you a little excitable, but nicotine, they say, and I'm not sure if we could check to see if that's still current, but they were, at the time I was practicing, they said that is the most highly addictive drug that they know. And if anybody in here has been a smoker and trying to quit, then you know about that. It doesn't lead to the behavioral changes you see with alcohol and other drugs, but certainly can be deadly in terms of lung cancer and the negative effects. Hallucinogens, LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, and there are others, and I really don't know a whole lot about that class of drugs, but they are out there. Ecstasy may be one of those. I'd have to look that one up. But again, I'm not real clear on a lot of the street drugs. And then you've got marijuana, which is kind of an entity unto itself. It can be classified as a depressant, which is the way I sort of think about it. People sort of get mellow under the influence. Usually you don't have the same kind of arguments and fighting and stuff that you get with alcohol in a bar. But it can be classified as a stimulant. And I know at high doses it does become a hallucinogen. So part of that is cannabinoids are complicated. There are a number of different substances in a typical joint, and nobody really knows all of their effects. You do have the negative effect of just smoking it, if that's the way it's being administered, but And then finally, I listed inhalants. I don't know if you've ever heard the term huffing. Now, those were some of the worst cases we dealt with. Those are people who were sniffing paint, or I guess it's hydrocarbon fumes that create a high.
Glue.
Glue can do it, yes. And they really, you're talking brain damage, liver, kidney damage. At higher doses, they become aggressive. It's a rough one. So anyway, a mood or a mind-altering chemical, and you can see how they vary. They're not all alike. But the thing they have in common is they produce a mood swing. They give a sense of euphoria, make us feel good, take away pain, reduce anxiety. People talk about getting a buzz on or being high. So and stop and think about that. Any drug that does that, where is that effect occurring in the body?
In your brain.
That's central nervous system. And so where do we think and reason? What governs our perception, how we see the world? Central nervous system. So we would likely expect that any of these things are going to change the way people see the world. And it's going to affect their thinking. Okay, questions so far, just on mind-altering drugs? All right. When you think of the word, when you see or hear the word alcoholic or addict, what comes to mind? What do you think about?
Can't live without it.
Addiction.
Okay,
People, homeless people.
okay.
Men,
Hmm?
men,
Mhm.
men. I don't think of women, men.
I think of women too.
Yeah.
They just have different drugs of choice.
Skid Row.
Skid Row, yeah. As you think about the culture just in general, how do we think about alcoholics or addicts?
We don't think of them the same way as we do as a drug addict.
That's-
Okay.
So alcohol is acceptable. I'm okay, I just have a few beers or a few dozen,
Right,
and that's different than this person that smokes marijuana
right.
or something, yeah.
I had a client one time tell me, Paul, I can stop anytime.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they always say.
And
And
they,
then he said, after I've had 12 beers.
Yeah.
So,
I've also heard, I can stop. I've done it 15 times.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Stopping is not the problem, it's starting again, which
Yeah.
is that's what creates a problem. What I'm getting at is, I think there's a stigma that relates to this disease. And you notice I'm calling it a disease. So if we think about cancer, or we think about heart disease, there's really not, well, is there a stigma that we associate with cancer or heart disease?
Well, if it's lung cancer, we say,
Yes, sometimes we do. We say, oh, you brought it on yourself,
mhm.
which we always say about the alcoholic or the addict. You brought it on yourself.
Or a diabetic, you ate
Oh,
too
yeah.
much. You ate
Yes,
too sweets,
okay.
and that's not necessarily true.
Now, you didn't watch your diet, and look what happened. So, yeah, what I think I'm getting at is that there's kind of a sliding scale. We may get after the diabetic or the cancer patient, but I think we're more harsh when it comes to addiction. And I think there's a stigma that goes with that. And that's why when they developed AA, that's what the anonymous is for.
Mhm.
On account of the stigma, the anonymity gives them a time and a place in which to begin their recovery, where they don't have to admit out in public that they're dealing with addiction. So, I want to introduce you to the disease concept of chemical dependency. And my claim is that this is a biologically based disease. It's not a moral problem or a moral failure, although it almost, if it goes far enough, it almost always leads to immoral behavior. I admit that. But the disease itself is not immoral. It's just a disease like any other disease. I gave you a definition, excuse me, from Johns Hopkins. Substance dependence is the medical term used to describe abuse of drugs or alcohol that continues even when significant problems related to their use have developed. Normally, we don't continue behavior that hurts us, do we?
I'm smoking.
Well, but
Yeah.
that's
That's an
addictive.
addiction,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, but sometimes you're an argumentative person, or a person like me, that always has something to say, and that's, you know, that continues.
Okay, so some behaviors, maybe.
Uh-huh.
That's probably not related to addiction.
No,
That's probably a personality trait or a behavior pattern.
right.
There's strong evidence of a genetic predisposition for addiction.
Yes.
I don't know if that's a surprise to anybody
No,
here, but
no.
they, and a lot of this research has been done quite a few years ago. There were twin studies done in the Scandinavian countries where they have detailed and long-term medical records that are available for study. And the researchers picked identical twins that had been adopted out into separate homes. So they knew they had the same genetic code. And what they were looking for was to see if they could identify what is the best predictor for alcoholism. Is it the environment in which you're raised, or is it your genetic code, your heredity? They really expected it to be environmental, but they looked at this data for about 30 years. And what they found was that the genetic, family history of genetics was a better predictor. So these twins, the ones who grew up in a family with alcoholism, didn't necessarily become alcoholic unless they had come from an alcoholic family biologically themselves, and vice versa. In other words, they just found that the genetic piece was a better predictor than environment. And notice that it's a predisposition, it's not a genetic disease in itself. It's not as simple as, say, I'm left-handed. That's pretty simple to figure out genetically speaking. There's only 1 or 2 genes involved. I don't know the details, but, or eye color, fairly simple. This predisposition is not that simple. I'm not sure they've ever really identified the pattern of genes that is involved. But it looks like there is some sort, it tends to run in families, in other words. And that's probably a genetic predisposition. It's a predisposition, it's not a death sentence. It doesn't mean that just because you had addiction in your family tree, that if you drink or use, you're going to get this disease. It just means that your chances of contracting the disease are higher, if that makes sense. I used to actually mention that in premarital counseling and say, you know, if you all got addiction in the family tree, you might want to be careful.
Yeah.
Just watch your own drinking and using if you choose, because you're probably at a higher risk than average if you've got that in your family tree.
You know, I'd like to add something here. I had a discussion with an in-law, not in my immediate family, but my extended family. And I won't go into what led up to this, but he finally says alcoholism is not genetic. Because I was reading Grant, and I had mentioned that the father of Grant is alcoholic. And he said, it is not, you can't excuse him, this is not alcohol, alcoholism is not inherited. He said, I should know, I have 15 alcoholics in my family. I was in their home,
Yeah, what you're saying is...
same thing, I thought, that's it, you can't talk about these things.
Right. Well, that's called denial. That's a major part of this disease.
And, well, they are completely teetotalers, I mean, they wouldn't touch anything.
Yeah.
Well,
Because
and
of
they're
his
safe. They will
experiences.
never develop the disease
But
because you're not...
I just couldn't,
And that's their response.
I didn't even want to know, what do you think? I mean, I thought, no, there's nothing he can say that's going to make me not feel
Right.
you're crazy.
And he may have needed to tell himself that,
Yeah.
as he was protecting himself.
One of the things that could be added to this same discussion would be things outside of alcoholism, such as smoking and such as eating fat foods that where one ends up with diabetes or some other
Mhm.
disease. They all fall into the same category.
Yeah. They all seem to fall out on a bell curve. And you can, the people that do statistics can pretty good, if you're working with a large enough group, they can pretty well tell you how many folks in that group are going to be susceptible to the disease. And when I was practicing, they were saying 7 to 10% of Americans have this genetic difference that puts them at risk.
So that would mean addiction also to, like Rich said, to eating too much or not eating enough like teenage girls, or even gambling. I mean, we experienced that a lot back in New York. Yeah, teachers and so on, oh, they went down to Atlanta City to spend the weekend gambling. I mean, they really had an addiction to it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And that is not a substance addiction.
No, but
Yeah,
it's
no,
an
it's-
addiction.
It might be accompanied by one, but it's, in and of itself, it's not a substance, it's a behavior.
And Paul, I have heard this, so we can all Google it. I haven't ever Googled it. But that some people are susceptible to addiction. Therefore, they might be an alcoholic, they might be a gambling, they might be a sex addict. There are, you know, that I don't know if that's been found to be, that experiment with the identical twins, that, you know, that's very convincing, but I don't know if anybody's ever,
Well, and that brings up the point that a lot of the research that has been done on alcohol. And so, when you look at the rest of these drugs, they all have their own characteristics. They're all addictive, but, you know, the research has been alcohol-based, primarily because they had to start somewhere.
no, that's an easy one.
Look.
I think I was just thinking about the difference between a physiological addiction, where if you don't get it, you get a reaction, versus an addiction to gambling. Your brain does some things that are uncomfortable maybe if you don't get it, but I mean, it's not a physiological. Well, maybe it
It
is,
is.
I don't know.
It's a brain chemistry.
Yeah.
My guess would be, it's probably that for certain folks, gambling stimulates dopamine
Right,
production
I
in the
know,
brain.
yeah.
And that's what
And if you don't get it,
powers
then
the addiction.
Might get a headache or something.
Yeah. Let's look at the characteristics of the disease. And I used to do this lecture once every 6 weeks in the treatment program, so it's bringing back memories. But characteristics of this disease, 4 of them. Number 1 is primary. That just means it's a disease in its own right. It's not a symptom of anything else. So you're not going to cure this disease or improve this disease by getting psychotherapy about childhood issues, or, you know, going to the psychiatrist and working on depression or anxiety. It's a disease in its own right and needs its own treatment. Now, it might be accompanied by other primary diseases, and that's where it really gets tricky in trying to do a treatment plan for patients, because there are people that suffer from clinical depression. And you'd better treat that too, because that is another primary disease. And those two aggravate each other. If you've got a clinically depressed person who's medicating himself with alcohol, you know, that's just exponential problems. So you need to treat both. But addiction in itself is primary and needs its own treatment. Progressive. Oh, go ahead.
How does vaping fit in?
Oh man, that's a good one, and I just don't know.
It's still the inhalant of a chemical.
Is it nicotine? I just don't know.
I don't know if it has, I haven't
The
looked.
problem is that they use nicotine as the addictive agent. There's just no regulation. Therefore, you could end up with all kinds of chemicals
Yeah.
in order to, just chemicals that vaporize stuff are dangerous within themselves.
Yes, they are.
And the physical act that you're going through is addictive. So you can even get one that's cherry flavored, but you still are hooked on something.
And we call that route of administration, meaning how does the substance get into your body? Inhaling and injecting are the most severe and have the most complications.
And that's.
Anything that you're inhaling is very quick, gets to the brain quickly,
Right.
so that's why addicts will do that. And that's dangerous. Let me get through the rest of this, and then I think we'll have enough time to do some discussion. Progressive. This is a progressive disease. That just means it gets worse over time. That's what makes this disease so dangerous. By the time a person realizes they're in trouble, it's too late. They've lost control. It sneaks up on people. It starts mild and gradually gets worse over time. With alcohol, you know, it might be 5 to 15 years to go from one end of the scale to the other. But then depending on the drug of choice, cocaine is a much more rapid progression. But it's still progressive. If the person continues their drinking or using, it's going to get worse. Chronic. This means it stays with victims over the course of time. It doesn't get better. So there's no cure, in other words. If you're chemically dependent, you are chemically dependent for life. The good news is this disease can be arrested. Just like they can force some kinds of cancer into remission, you can force this disease into remission by abstinence, education, and support. You know, that, in a nutshell, that's what recovery is all about. So that's good news, bad news. The bad news is, that's why Alcoholics Anonymous says recovering, not recovered, ED, because it's an ongoing process. And finally, it is a fatal disease. At least potentially. It does kill in a variety of ways. I listed a few. Liver damage, brain damage, accidental overdose, bar room or drug-related violence, automobile accident, suicide, just to name a few. So the disease does take human lives in a variety of ways. So, pretty serious stuff. Let's go through the symptoms and progression. I'll try to do this quickly to leave some time for questions. We're looking at the Jelinek curve. E.M. Jelinek was one of the pioneering researchers in alcoholism. He came up with this set of symptoms. We're going to look at the first half very briefly this morning. Starting at the top, at the left-hand side, you have occasional relief drinking. Relief drinking is when you take a substance like alcohol because you're anxious or upset. Probably social drinkers do that once in a while. It's drinking for the effect of calming anxiety. But then notice the next symptom is constant relief drinking commences. Now, every time a person feels anxious, they immediately turn to the bottle. There's a beginning increase in alcohol tolerance, which means now it's taking more beers or more wine or whatever they're drinking to get the same effect. And oddly enough, there's evidence that folks with the genetic predisposition have a higher than usual tolerance right off the bat. So they're set up. In the beginning, they think, oh, I can handle this. And their genetics seems to produce a more intense high. It's almost as if it meets some sort of a deficit, and it's like a where have you been all my life experience. It's very powerful, it's very addicting, and you begin to see them sneaking their drinking, because they're already a little bit nervous about what's going on, so they're not honest about it. There's an increasing dependence on alcohol. At that stage, it's not physical, but it's psychological. The urgency of first drinks. If you've ever been in a bar and seen somebody order a beer and a chaser, or 2 beers, and the first one goes down almost in a gulp, and then the second one, that's part of that disease where they're looking for the onset, that first onset of the high. Guilt, won't talk about the problem. Memory blackouts occur fairly early in some people. Not all alcoholics, but some. And now a blackout is not passing out. A blackout is when the person is awake and functioning and talking and doing things, but won't remember. The next morning, wake up and have no idea what went on for 3 hours. That's a blackout. They happen more often. There's a decrease of ability to stop drinking when others do. Go out to a party, everyone else has had enough, but the potential alcoholic can't stop. They need another one. Drinking bolstered with excuses. That's rationalizing, an unreasonable reason for doing something. Well, I had to drink. The Jayhawks won. Well, I had to drink. The Jayhawks lost. It's an unreasonable reason. Grandiose and aggressive behavior, persistent remorse, efforts to control fail repeatedly. That's the key. That's when it's really setting itself up as a disease. By the time the person realizes he needs to control his drinking, it's already gone. It's beyond control. He finds himself drinking anyway. He tries to stop and can't. And loss of control doesn't mean every time a person drinks they're totally out of control. get arrested or DUI or have a fight or embarrass themselves. It just means they can no longer safely predict when that stuff will happen. So they go out drinking every night for 3 weeks, no problems. The 4th week, all of a sudden, can't stop, drives drunk, gets in a wreck or gets a DUI or gets in a fight or whatever, winds up in jail. And the point is not that that happens every time, but they just can't predict when that's going to happen. Geographical escape, well, let's start over, get a new job, because my boss has been on me. Get away from my drinking buddies, but they find new drinking buddies pretty quickly. Loss of other interests, because now life is beginning to revolve around the drug of choice. Avoid family and friends, work and money troubles, unreasonable resentments, neglect of food, loss of ordinary willpower. At that point, you're not showing up for work, you're missing appointments. Tremors, now that's a sign of physical dependency. When you get up in the morning and the person is shaking, that's a physical withdrawal syndrome. Drinking in the morning, physical deterioration, onset of lengthy intoxications, moral deterioration, impaired thinking, drinking with chronic users. That's one of the biggest issues we had in treatment, was trying to convince people that their drinking buddies weren't really their friends, that they needed a new set of friends who were recovering. Boy, that's a tough one. Indefinable fears, unable to initiate action, obsession with drinking, vague spiritual desires, all alibis exhausted, complete defeat admitted, and then for some, just this constant obsessive cycles of drinking. Hitting bottom, you could say. And in treatment, we would try to bring the bottom up to the alcoholic. A lot of our patients were court ordered. They had a DUI, they had jail time on the shelf, so if they completed a program and passed breathalyzers, they could stay on probation and not do their jail time. So that was a pretty powerful motivator. Let's see, how are we doing on time?
We got 20 more minutes.
All right, let me run through the
People
terms.
who have to go to the bar.
All right, let me run through the terms on the back of your sheet, and then we'll do discussion. I'm sorry for those of you that have to leave, but I understand that's got things to do. I should
And
add.
I call that a better offer,
Yeah, very good.
whether it is or not.
I should add social drinker to the terms. That's somebody who just drinks socially. Drink at a wedding reception, because that's what you do at a wedding reception. Glass of wine at dinner, that kind of thing. No need to control drinking, because drinking is not out of control. If it's not a problem, it's not a problem. Tolerance, that develops with all these chemicals. It takes more and more to get the desired effect. The danger there is that particularly with narcotics, is that you have a range between what you might call a therapeutic dose, when you get the effect you're looking for, and an overdose. So the more tolerance increases, the shorter that range. And so eventually, narcotics addicts especially wind up very on a razor's edge. By the time they take enough to get the effect they're looking for, they're close to overdosing. So that's tolerance. Withdrawal is a physical syndrome, a medical condition. With alcohol, you get tremors, you can get hallucinations, physical illness, delirium tremens, even death in some cases. Now that's with chronic daily drinking at a heavy dose. If you suddenly stop, that is life-threatening. Oddly enough, the legal drug in our culture is the most dangerous to withdraw from. Who knew? Go figure. Withdrawal from narcotics, very miserable but not life-threatening. We used to have trouble. The original diagnosis for chemical dependency was you had to have increased tolerance and a physical withdrawal syndrome. But with some drugs, there really isn't much of a withdrawal. Marijuana stays in your system so long that there's not that much of a withdrawal. And same thing with cocaine. It comes out of the system quickly and doesn't present a medical emergency. It's horrible. The depression is terrible to go through, but it's not a medical emergency. Blackouts we covered, loss of control we covered. The disease is subject to relapse. We had the rule of thirds based on research. Of course, research in recovery is tenuous because it's self-reporting and you never know how honest people are being. But we used to say a third of our patients got sober and stayed sober. Another third had a series of relapses but eventually found long-term sobriety. The other third were just not able to do it. So depending on how you look at that, it's good or bad. If you get a 2/3 recovery rate, that looks pretty good. But if you're still losing a third of your patients over the long haul, that's serious. So,
Paul?
drug of choice, most people with this disease have a preferred chemical. They'll switch if they need to, but they usually come back to their drug of choice. It may change over time, but a drug of choice, dry drunk versus sobriety. A dry drunk is somebody who's no longer drinking but hasn't changed any of the negative behavior patterns, any of the negative thinking, attitudes. They're a royal pain to deal with. Sobriety means you're getting well totally, psychologically, socially, medically. You're making life changes. Things are getting better all the way around. Preoccupation goes with this disease. Life revolves around the chemical. Denial is just built in. Oh, I'm not an alcoholic. I'm only drinking beer. Although I drink a 12-pack every night. I'm not an alcoholic. I don't drink every day.
I'm not an alcoholic because I don't drink alone.
Yes.
I've heard that.
Yes.
Yeah,
I only hurt myself.
yeah.
And then you say, but weren't you in the bar 5 nights a week? Don't you think that had an effect on your family? And that's what you do in treatment, is you work in a group to help people see those things. Defenses, minimizing, oh, it's not that bad. Blaming, well, I wouldn't have to drink if you weren't such a
Yeah.
supply your harsh word. Rationalizing unreasonable reasons, avoidance, procrastination, I'll quit tomorrow, that kind of stuff. And you can summarize that by the AA phrase, stinking thinking. So when you begin to address your stinking thinking is when you begin to get sober. And finally, the theory that addiction may occur in the old brain, which is that part of the brain that's responsible for survival level mechanisms like the urge to reproduce, the urge to get something to eat, something to drink, just talking about water in that case, fluids, the urge to get shelter, that these chemicals probably fool that part of the brain into thinking the chemical is necessary for survival. And so people find themselves, it's almost as if their brain is making decisions for them, but not the rational part of the brain that we use to think and reason. All right, now that's the block of material I wanted to
That's
present.
terrific.
Now let's,
Two things. One, what you just said, do you suppose that when you're born, part of your, we have different parts of our brain. I wonder if they could check out and test the people that, maybe there are more people that have the old brain and other people don't have the old brain. And that your particular ethnic group or whatever has more of the old brain or less of the old brain. That would be, yeah.
there is some evidence that cultures that drink heavily build up some resistance over time, and cultures that don't drink strong alcohol. I'm thinking of Native Americans
Yeah.
who did drink a form of beer, but never any hard liquor, and they were sitting ducks for this
Yeah,
disease.
right.
They have no natural, so maybe evolution or just adaptability eventually produces some resistance or some.
And the other thing that was one of two. The other one is, you said a third. The last third was like they're never gonna get well or something like that. Methadone, isn't that something that a person can take instead of alcohol?
No, that's used for narcotic addiction. It's used to replace the narcotic drug of
But
choice.
I thought there was something you could take that if you drank, you're taking this drug because the doctor said take it, and then you have a drink and you get sick.
Yes, there is medication. And the trick there is getting people to continue to take it.
Yeah.
But, yes, there is and there are also narcotic inhibitors that people can take. It means when they take a narcotic, it doesn't provide the effect they're looking for. It seems to block that.
When I read some of this, I crave chocolate. And I thought, I think I'm addicted. But I can say, and not just any chocolate, I want chocolates with almonds in them.
Yes.
Oh,
Chocolate covered almonds.
right.
And I'll say, you can have 3 of those if you get this much done.
Mm.
If you get the kitchen cleaned up, then you can have 3.
Ah, so a reward
So
system.
I can limit it. I mean, I can say, okay.
Yeah, but you didn't go down to 2, so maybe you can't limit it.
That's
That's your
limited to 2.
threshold.
I have to. And so then I tried, and it's milk chocolate. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna get the dark chocolate. And that did work, 'cause that's not near
Dark
as
chocolate's good for you, know.
tasty. I know.
That's
Yeah.
what they say.
The dark
Yeah.
chocolate is. and
We all know of A, don't
I
we?
just don't.
I think that, my opinion of that, because I've heard many cardiologists say that it's good for you to have coffee. And I think, or it's good to have red wines. And I think what they're saying is, it won't hurt you any more than anything else. It's not that it's
Oh, you got
good for you, and it makes you better.
Or they're paying off their school bills.
Yeah, that's all paid off.
All things have negative side effects. And if you develop a condition, and all of a sudden the doctor tells you, this condition is made worse by this, and this, and you say, gosh, chocolate can make things worse. The small amount of caffeine in in chocolate and other things, if you have other issues, it can just dramatically make them worse. It's surprising how little amounts of certain chemicals, just like they're catalyst or something. When I went to college, I'm a chemical engineer, and I learned about catalysts and how they make other things happen. And to have something as innocent as a piece of chocolate giving you fits, and you wake up in the middle of the night with terrible symptoms because you had a piece of chocolate. But it wasn't because of chocolate, it was because the small amount of caffeine in there, if you have certain conditions, can make it go out of control.
I read an article once that oxys actually change the receptor site that helps your body feel pain. So that once it's changed that receptor site, it's a permanent change. And the only thing that will take away the feeling of pain is more oxy, or more of that type of drug. And I found that rather interesting. I don't know that that was a scientific study or not, but it was like, so just by that, when going in for a knee replacement and they give you oxy,
Yes.
all of a sudden you're an addict. But that's what a lot of people are saying. I had back pain, or I had back surgery, or I had this, or I had whatever it was, and all of a sudden they can't do without the oxy. So
It does, these chemicals do deplete natural neurotransmitters. Excuse me.
Certain chemicals that are deleterious, if they get into your body at places where that material can destroy things, then those cells are destroyed, and there's no recovery from that, because that's a permanent destruction.
I wanted to ask, now is OxyContin, is that what is also oxycodone, hydrocodone? Do they
I'm not
fit in?
sure.
Where do they fit?
OxyContin is a trade name
Oh, okay.
for a
There's-
form of narcotic.
It's the name of the chemical you just said.
Well,
But there's-
hydrocodone.
Hydrocodone is a chemical
and
name, and
oxycodone
oxycontin
are two that are given
is a
for extreme
trade
pain in
name.
different areas.
But there's ones for prescription that can only be used in a hospital, and there's ones that can be used by pill, and there might even be something that sounds oxy-like that you can get over the counter, but usually the one that's controlled, the controlled substance is usually the higher level one.
Because I know my husband had trouble taking it, and he would just rather have, I mean, he had some really painful surgeries with his legs and hips and all. And it would, you know, sometimes it wouldn't even touch it, and he said, I'm just going without it because I can't stand it, you know. what it
Well,
did to his
there are other,
stomach. So then he got,
there are other older,
Tramadol is one that is
there are
weak.
older pain relievers that have been around for a long time that don't cause the destructions.
Like Tramadol.
And, but you have to be on them at higher doses. And they do have the effect, if you're on it for as long as they think you're gonna have to be on it to sense the pain, then you become chemically addicted.
I mean,
You
there's
can-
so much with, you know, with the Purdue situation, you know, the lawsuits.
Oh, yeah.
And all the money, I
You
don't
can
have
be
enough.
physically dependent on a narcotic and not be chemically dependent in the sense of loss of control over behavior. You just need to be taken off the, if you're physically dependent, you need a detox regime. They call it titrating, wean you off gradually, so that you don't have the uncomfortable withdrawal.
Being in the, working in, I'm a respiratory therapist, and so I was there for breathing problems, but, hearing people, if they're yelling down the hall after the nurses says they're gonna start you on something, they'll say, well, that's not a high enough dose, I need this dose. You know that they're a
Yes.
drug-seeking person.
Right.
And sometimes I came to realize, and ER nurses will say it, people injure themselves or do something to injure themselves so they can come in
Yeah.
So they can get it.
and get their drug of choice.
Yeah.
Because they'll almost always send it, because the idea in the ER is to get them going. Treat them, get them going,
Right.
and so they'll give them a small dosage to go. So,
How about Percocet?
Percocet is also a narcotic, yes.
I've wondered about a relationship between all this stuff we've been talking and allergies. And you kind of brought that back to my mind. When you've had just a little bit of chocolate, and that might have a little bit of caffeine and that might cause other things. And I thought, you know, why do some people have allergies to certain things? And allergies kind of, the symptoms are an unusual, how can I put it? Hay fever, ragweed, whatever. Some people react to it and other people don't. And I'm thinking that's kind of like, you know,
Yes.
some people get addicted to alcohol and some people don't.
Yes,
it's your own body chemistry.
Yeah, I'm
And
thinking that
it's-
there's kind of a little bit of overlap between it.
Right, and they take you off when you find out something you're allergic to, then they remove it from your diet.
Right.
I heard an alcoholic say he was allergic to alcohol. I break out in places like jail.
That's good.
That's fun.
Humor helps.
Humor helps.
We're just about out of time. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Great.
This was good. Do we have to do anything with that?
I think Dave's coming back to turn it off. I hope so, anyway. I better put this back on and be.
Somebody who has a grant, somebody that they know that has COVID.
Oh, it's a big
come, so they
Next week will be more encouraging.
And tell me the topic again.
Recovery, treatment and recovery.
Okay.
12
Don't
steps.
forget the silent auction
Yes. Is it in the, where's it set
in the
out?
fellowship hall.
Okay.
You can't miss it.
Okay.
It's like,
Lots of stuff.
I'm gonna let,
Yeah, there is.
you know what, Yvonne, let's move this forward.
I'll see you up front.
Marilyn?
I think they were thinking of having.
Hi, I'm fine, how are you?
Yeah, good.
Real expensive things, you know, just to see what
Did you make it?
Oh, yeah. I'm getting physical therapy now, so I'm looking.
Well, I am too.
I'm looking forward to this, not continuing like
I'm
this.
gonna move your chair.
Thank you so much.
Sit that down.
Yes, thank
Are they
you.
doing this
Thank you,
for
thank you.
retraining?
Commercial,
Okay.
and I think about 20.
Wait a minute.
the present.
Oh, okay, 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 I see,
What's going on
okay,
over there?
good point. Okay.
Terrible.
Well, and then our
Paul, I
son
really
says,
like the way you got organized, you're doing a
"Why
great
not you have
job.
my Wichita annually?" Have you seen those?
No.
Tornado. I mean,
Oh.
it just goes in there, and you just see the houses move, you know, this wind.
And we don't have a basement.
Oh, you don't? Well, we've lived here, I've lived in Kansas all my life, except for 9 summers in Florida. And I've only been in a tornado once, and it didn't come to our house. It was over here on Iowa Street, we were about 2 miles.
We had close calls in Cincinnati. You know,
Oh, yeah.
Tornado alley seems to be moving east.
Well,
Yeah, they're wicked storms.
yeah. I'm afraid to put my coat, hang it up, because you never know what the sanctuary is gonna be
I
like.
know. Especially this time of year.
This time of year. You know, you don't have the heat, and you don't have the air conditioning. I mean, it's a good time of year.
Eventually produces some resistance or some,
And the other thing I want, that was one of two. The other one is, you said a third. that last third was like they're never gonna get well or something like that. Methadone, isn't that something that a person can take instead of alcohol?
No, that's used for narcotic addiction. It's used to replace the narcotic drug of
But
choice.
I thought there was something you could take that if you drank, you're taking this drug because the doctor said take it, and then you have a drink and you get sick.
Yes, there is medication. The trick there is getting people to continue to take it.
Yeah.
But, yes, there is and there are also narcotic inhibitors that people can take. It means when they take a narcotic, it doesn't provide the effect they're looking for. It seems to block that.
When I read some of this, I crave chocolate, and I thought, I think I'm addicted. But I can say, and not just any chocolate, I want chocolates with almonds in it.
Yes.
Oh,
Chocolate covered almonds.
right.
And I'll say, you can have 3 of those if you get this much done.
Mm.
If you get the kitchen cleaned up, then you can have 3.
So a reward
So
system.
I can limit it. I mean, I can say, okay.
Yeah, but you didn't go down to 2, so maybe you can't limit it.
That's
That's your
limited to
threshold.
2. I have to. And so then I tried, and it's milk chocolate. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna get the dark chocolate. And it did work, 'cause that's not
Dark
near as
chocolate's good for you, know.
tasty. I know.
That's
Yeah.
what they say.
The dark
Yeah.
chocolate is. and
We all know of A, don't
I
we?
just don't.
I think that, my opinion of that, because I've heard many cardiologists say that it's good for you to have coffee. And I think, or it's good to have red wines. And I think what they're saying is, it won't hurt you any more than anything else. It's not that it's good for you, it makes you better.
Or they're paying off their school bills.
All things have negative side effects. And if you develop a condition, and all of a sudden the doctor tells you, this condition is made worse by this, and this, and you say, gosh, chocolate can make things worse. The small amount of caffeine in coffee and in chocolate and other things, if you have other issues, it can just dramatically make them worse. It's surprising how little amounts of certain chemicals, just like they're catalyst or something. When I went to college, I'm a chemical engineer, and I learned about catalysts and how they make other things happen. And to have something as innocent as a piece of chocolate giving you fits, and you wake up in the middle of the night with terrible symptoms because you had a piece of chocolate. But it wasn't because of chocolate, it was because the small amount of caffeine in there, if you have certain conditions, can make it go out of control.
I read an article once that oxys actually change the receptor site that helps your body feel pain. So that once it's changed that receptor site, it's a permanent change. And the only thing that will take away the feeling of pain is more oxy, or more of that type of drug. And I found that rather interesting. I don't know that that was a scientific study or not, but it was like, so just by that, when going in for a knee replacement and they give you oxy,
Yes.
all of a sudden you're an addict. But that's what a lot of people are saying. I had back pain, or I had back surgery, or I had this, or I had whatever it was, and all of a sudden they can't do without the oxy. So
It does. These chemicals do deplete natural neurotransmitters. Excuse me.
Certain chemicals that are deleterious, if they get into your body at places where that material can destroy things, then those cells are destroyed, and there's no recovery from that, because that's a permanent destruction.
I wanted to ask, Now, is OxyContin, is that what is also oxycodone, hydrocodone? Do they
I'm not
fit in-
sure.
where do they fit?
OxyContin is a trade name
Oh, okay.
for a
There's-
form of narcotic.
It's the name of the chemical you just said.
Well,
But there's-
hydrocodone.
Hydrocodone is a chemical
and
name, and
oxycodone
oxycontin
are two that are given
is a
for extreme
trade
pain in
name.
different areas.
But there's ones for prescription that can only be used in a hospital, and there's ones that can be used by pill. And there might be something that sounds oxy-like that you can get over the counter, but usually the one that's controlled, the controlled substance is usually the higher level one.
Because I know my husband had trouble taking it, and he would just rather have, I mean, he had some really painful surgeries with his legs and hips and all. And it would, you know, sometimes it wouldn't even touch it, and he said, I'm just going without it because I can't stand it, you know, what it did
Well,
to his
there are other,
stomach. So then he got,
there are other older,
tramadol is one that is
there are
weak.
older pain relievers that have been around for a long time that don't cause the destructions.
Like tramadol.
And, but you have to be on them at higher doses. And they do have the effect, if you're on it for as long as they think you're gonna have to be on it to sense the pain, then you become chemically addicted.
I mean,
You
there's so
can-
much with, you know, with the Purdue situation, you know, the lawsuits.
Oh, yeah.
And all the money, I
You can
don't
be
have enough.
physically dependent on a narcotic and not be chemically dependent in the sense of loss of control over behavior. You just need to be taken off the, if you're physically dependent, you need a detox regime. They call it titrating, wean you off gradually, so that you don't have the uncomfortable withdrawal.
Being working in, I'm a respiratory therapist, and so I was there for breathing problems, but, hearing people, if they're yelling down the hall after the nurses says they're gonna start you on something, they'll say, well, that's not a high enough dose, I need this dose. You know that they're a
Yes.
drug-seeking person.
Right.
And sometimes I came to realize, and ER nurses will say it, people injure themselves or do something to injure themselves so they can come in
So they could get it.
and get their drug of choice.
Yeah.
Because they'll almost always send, because the idea in the ER is to get them going. Treat them, get them going.
Right.
And so they'll give them a small dosage to go. So,
How about Percocet?
Percocet is also a narcotic, yes.
I've wondered about a relationship between all this stuff we've been talking and allergies. And you kind of brought that back to my mind. When you had just a little bit of chocolate, and that might have a little bit of caffeine, and that might cause other things. And I thought, you know, why do some people have allergies to certain things? And allergies kind of, the symptoms are an unusual, how can I put it? Hay fever, ragweed, whatever. Some people react to it and other people don't. And I'm thinking it's kind of like, you know,
Yes.
some people get addicted to alcohol and some people don't.
Yes,
it's your own body chemistry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that
Yes.
there's kind of a little bit of overlap between it.
Right, and they take you off when you find out something you're allergic to, then they remove it from your diet.
Right.
I heard an alcoholic say he was allergic to alcohol. He says, "When I drink, I break out in places like jail."
That's good.
That's fun.
Humor helps.
Humor helps.
We're just about out of time. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much.